he's panting a little bit. That's why they cool off. They don't have sweat glands. But also, if I move my hand up and down, you notice his head kind of likes to stay relatively still. And also, when an owl turns his head, you may notice the eyes never turn of this owl. And of course, one of the questions I get about owls is, how far can they turn their heads? The answer is 270 degrees is the most they can do it. 3/4 of the turn. So if I wanted to show off and be an owl, I can show what an owl could do. I could turn my head completely around, look behind me, keep on going, and look over there at the hornet's nest by going this direction. But in my experience, the owls seldom do that. They do often turn and look 180 degrees behind them. But sometimes they turn and twist around so it looks like the head spun 360 degrees. But their eyes never move. Their eyes are fixed in a socket. And they've got these huge eyes with no muscles left over in the skull space to move them around. So you can hold your head still and you can roll your eyes up, look left and right, and a lot of periphery vision. Owl can't do that. So if it has to look 1 inch any way, 1/2 inch up, down, whatever, his whole head has to go with it. The eyes are fixed into place. And, but they've got great mobility, extra vertebrae in their neck there to be able to turn their head a lot more than most other animals can. He is looking at me because I'm the only human here that's going to bother him. You know, he doesn't like me. He doesn't like you. He's an owl. We're humans. But he knows you're not going to harm him. You're not going to touch him. You're not going to pull him out of that cage. You're not going to hoot at him. He knows smart enough that I'm the person that he has to worry about the most. So he watches me constantly, not out of admiration. Because he is a wild owl, just had to learn to be in captivity because of his unfortunate circumstances. But I always say his bad fortunes are good luck. Allows us to see a bird like this up close in captivity and learn more about him, and maybe pay attention a little bit more about the habitat we leave behind for owls in the wild. Maybe drive a little slower, knowing that owls hunt along the side of the highway, and just to appreciate those things that are out there we don't get to see very often. Yes.
In the area I live, which is up above Triumph, we're heavily covered in woods up there. And all this year, I'm up before dawn almost every day, and only in the last month or so have I started hearing you guys closer and closer and closer to that whole area.
Right, yeah.
So is there a time of the year with their activity?
There is a time of year, usually with this type of owl, usually February and March, we hear increased calls of these owls. That's their breeding season. So, but at any time of year, particularly this time of year, it could be establish their territories that you're starting to hear call a little bit more than usual. But the best time to hear owls are usually during the breeding season. But that varies with different kinds of owls. So there's another owl we're going to meet here in just a moment. Actually, the breeding season is coming up really close now, and going around November and December is a good time to hear them. But this owl is mostly heard breeding calls in the February and March is the best time to hear them. They can breed in captivity, but usually don't. They have to have specialized conditions usually to do that.
Have there been
Studies of what? Well, you hear about the wise old owl. That's simply not true. They're smart birds, but no smart than anything other bird. If you listen, he's smart enough to sound like a duck, though. They make a lot of unusual sounds. That's kind of a stress relief thing. But owls are not any smarter than any other bird out there. In fact, they're probably dumber than some as far as intelligence goes, compared to something like a parrot or a bird like that.
How about compared to a crow?
Nothing smarter than a crow. Crows are extremely intelligent. So intelligence-wise, I'd rate the crow much higher than an owl. It's just simply a territorial type mating call. Just who cooks for you, cooks for you all. Yeah, basically. Yeah.
How long did it take after he was brought in that you could start handling?
It took a while for him to heal up and all. It took a few months for that. But once I actually started working with him, he made a quick adjustment in just a few weeks to be able to use the glove. But then I had to slowly introduce him to people along the way. So that took a little bit longer. Some of it take longer. So. Okay, moving right along here. The next bird we want to talk about is also a bird we're going to get a chance to visit with here. And this might be the most exciting bird you see, depending on what you think of these birds. And this is one called the, your time is over, hush. Called the great horned owl. Great horned owl. And great horned owls are pretty common birds too. There may be actually more common in their distribution in North America, and then a barred owl, which is mostly in the Midwest, eastern United States, but they are actually expanding range. But great horned owls have been found in every state of the United States, so they're pretty widespread. Not in every single habitat, but they are widespread, found in every state. Great horned owls are our largest native owl we have in this area. Adult females sometimes weighing as much as 4 pounds. More average male might be 2.5 to 3 pounds, or female 3.5, something like that. But they're much heavier than these birds, but still they're pretty lightweight when you compare how big they actually are. And great horned owls have a very wide wingspan. So this wingspan can be approaching 5 feet for a great horned owl. Okay, and great horned owls are pretty common in our area here, particularly anywhere we have the proper habitat, which is mostly deep woods. They have a tendency to hunt a lot along pasture edges where you keep livestock, where you agricultural areas where you have fields and pasture beaten wood lots, that sort of thing. So, but they're found in a lot of different situations. But one of the more common birds, I know where I live, up in the Mills River area, but they're pretty common in a lot of other areas as well. So we'll take out a great horned owl here. A little bit rather. This is a female. Female horned owls are pretty noticeably bigger than the males. But once again, they look the same. And where I've had the barred owl we just saw, Harry, which was nicknamed Harry because the guy who brought him to me and found him, he just thought he looked like a Harry, so I kept him. You know, that doesn't sound like a great owl name, but it's fine. This bird I've had for about 16 years, and you would never believe that I've had this bird this long because this bird hisses at me, at me, hates me, despises me every single day, even though basically I helped save its life and brought it back to health and feed and take care of it each day. Birds are wild creatures. They don't understand that sort of thing. So this is a great horned owl. Yeah. No affection there whatsoever. Great horned owl. Okay, so we're going to let our great horned owl sit there because this owl likes to sit on a perch much better than my hand, and we're going to clip her in, and we'll talk a little bit about great horned owls. Now, great horned owls are very, very strong owls. In fact, they're sometimes referred to as tigers of the night, is a nickname, and they do look like a predatory tiger-like animal. I mean, those big yellow eyes staring at you, the colors they have. But mostly they're just a very, very powerful bird. Their feet are like bear traps. Their talons are long. They have sharp talons, needle-sharp talons. The talons are as big as you'd find on a 90, 100-pound dog with a bear trap ability to grab something. Something that goes in the talons of a great horned owl don't come out again unless the great horned owl releases its grip. In fact, the great horned owl, if it tried hard enough, it could actually go through this glove here. So when we get them in for rehabilitation, we have to be very, very careful with them because the talons are very, very deadly weapons. And they use them for defense as well. But you notice a great horned owl has a great name. It is named for the feathers that stick up. They're not horns and they're not ears. You notice that this owl's ticked off at me right now and they're laid back. And I'd say that's a little bit like a dog. You ever see a dog that has his ears laid back? You don't go pet a dog that has his ears laid back. You know, that's a sign like, I'm going to bite you or something. But if a dog is very alert or happy, the ears go up, listen, that sort of thing. So right now this owl is ticked off. And it may be this entire time. But luckily I can kind of manipulate them a little bit here. So give you what they look like when they're at a more of an alert status there. But it's a great name, great horned owls, but we really don't know what the purpose of those so-called horns are. They're just feathers. They don't have anything to do with the hearing. They probably help break up the outline of the owl somewhat because any angular part of the body that doesn't look totally rounded or square is going to be something else that's going to blend you into your background. And the colors of this owl, of course, help blend it in very well as also. But also it is a little bit of a mood indicator there as well. But there's a fancy name for those feather tufts. They're actually called plumicorns. So if you want to add vocabulary and use a word that nobody else has heard of and probably you won't ever use again. Plumicorns. Plumicorns are the feather tufts that stick up on a great horned owl. Now, we're going to hear the calls of the great horned owl. Then I'll tell you a little bit about the story of this owl and why it's in captivity, because it is also unreleasable. Meanwhile, she's doing a little bit of, maybe we can get a little demonstration of the neck turning ability here, head turning. There we go, 180 degrees. Oh, there we go. So once they get to the 180-degree spot, they usually turn back the other way. But if they wanted to show off, they could go another 90 degrees. So you're smart enough, you don't need to show off, right? There you go. It'd be nice if you face the audience. Right. Yes.
Looks like he's trying.
Okay. So we heard that hooting sound, that's the great horned owl, and they start calling a lot in November. About the time we get to Thanksgiving, they're actually pairing up for the year. If they don't already have a mate from last year, calling. There's actually laying eggs by the first part of the year in January. By the end of January, come Groundhog Day, their eggs are probably hatched. They're on the nest. And by the way, their nest it can be a hollow tree cavity, but normally not a hole in a tree. It might be a broken off snag. But a lot of times they make a nest out of an old squirrel's nest or an old red-tailed hawk nest, maybe bring in a few extra sticks. So it's usually an open nest, which is kind of unusual for a bird that actually lays its eggs and starts to raise it young in the middle of the winter. But they get an early start because they have a very long developmental period. And the babies are not actually able to fly and fledge and be totally on their own until mid to late summer. So there's a lot of great horned owls that are just now getting rid of their kids, and they may be still in the same habitat nearby. The young birds, once they get off the nest, they are not small like a screech owl, so you never will mistake them for a baby screech owl for a baby great horned owls. The babies are huge, and when they leave the nest, they're already the size of the adults and have the adult coloration there. But sometimes we find them on the ground in March of the year. A lot of times when baby great horned owls get big enough to start moving around, they have a tendency to fall out of the nest, or a windstorm may come along and you may find a big fluffy white owl on the ground that's not ready to fly yet. Usually the parents continue to take care of the owls on the ground, so you probably shouldn't pick up and try to help an owl like that. And a lot of times they get pushed out of the nest a little bit before they're actually able to fly anyway. So the parents are there, they're taking care of them, a mother and a father, and we normally don't need to step in and help. But the babies do follow the parents through the woods throughout the summer. They have these sometimes begging cries that they do to the parents, begging for food. And we hear some of these sounds. Sometimes we wonder what they are. And a lot of begging cries sound a little different that aren't taped here. But they make other sounds that don't sound like the hooting sound. So you wouldn't know exactly what kind of a sound that you're hearing. So you could easily mistake it for something else. Yes?
Owls migrate at all?
Most owls do not migrate, with the exception of a couple we'll talk about towards the end of the program here. But for the most part, the owls you see at any time of year, they're there year-round. They may move around within their habitat looking for different food sources, but they usually don't migrate out dozens or hundreds or even thousands of miles like other birds often do. Now, this owl, we call her Owl Vira. And, like I said, I've had her about 16 years, but she has a story that is very similar to a lot of other owls I've had to work with. And we see this more in this type of owl than others, but it can happen with any bird. But this owl was found tangled in a barbed wire fence. And when I see barbed wire fences, I've always hated barbed wire fences. When I was a kid, running through the woods, I was always getting snagged in a barbed wire fence. Wherever I want to go, I had to climb over a barbed wire fence or under one, But barbed wire fences are terrible things to have if you enjoy wildlife, because they don't know what they are. And wherever you have fields and pasture where you have barbed wire fences, the cattle, horses, whatever, don't graze as close to the barbed wire. Probably the grass and brush grows up a little bit, provides a little travel lane for different animals to travel from one part of the forest to another, particularly across an open area like a pasture or field. But it provides a great hunting place for an owl like this to find its food. So they zero in on those spots. They come swooping down. Last thing they do with their wings spread out like that, pulling their talons forward to grab their prey. As they stop and swing down to pick up their prey, the wing gets snagged in a barbed wire fence. And it's a very common injury to find owls with wing injuries. Sometimes these wing injuries we see are from getting hit by cars along the highway, but a lot of them are wounds from getting snagged on a barbed wire fence. And that's particularly bad because if they get on there very tightly, they'll twist and they'll turn, and sometimes they've been known to actually wrench their wing completely off trying to get off fence. Otherwise, they may be found hanging there, for days until they die of dehydration or starvation, or another predator comes along and finishes them off. That's what happened with this owl. It was found hanging from a barbed wire fence, very emaciated, very weak. Somebody brought me the owl plus the barbed wire fence still embedded, and it took about 6 months for the wound to heal. The injury was so bad it went down. You could see tendons, the bone, big open wound in the joint, which is one of the worst places for a bird to have an injury, because that wing joint is never going to be the same. So this owl has a lot of trouble flying at all, even to this day. And for many years, the wing actually drooped down. It's not as droopy as it used to be. But this owl is definitely unreleasable to wild, but that happens quite often. Barbed wires, fences are terrible things. And I always say we can't do much about our highways other than slow down a little bit and knowing that animals are there. But we can do something about barbed wire fences. There are other alternative type fences, but barbed wire may be cheap, but please, if you have fencing, don't put it up. Use something else instead of barbed wire.
How old will this bird, or typically a barn owl?
Okay, good. In a captivity, great horned owls have one of the longevity records. They might be able to live 25, 30 years in captivity. And I don't know how old this bird was when I first got it, but I've had it for 16 years, so it easily could be 20 years. It could have another 5, 10, 15 years ago, for all we know. But they are one of the longer lived birds of prey in captivity. But none of these birds would live anywhere near that in the wild, because once you get old as a predator, you get weak. So maybe 10 years or so in the wild might be a little bit more average, something like a great horned owl. Yeah. Any more questions about owl vira?
We've got a lot of coyotes that have recently moved into our area. Also have some barn owls based on the malls. What's the impact of more and more coyotes coming into our area on birds?
Probably not much, because these birds nest high off the ground. The coyotes aren't going to be able to feed on the babies or anything like that. They might find an occasional chick that's fallen out of the nest, something like that, And but these birds are pretty powerful prey, and a very young coyote pup could be food for a great horned owl. In fact, in our area here, great horned owls routinely feed their favorite prey are skunks. Skunks. You say, well, how can they eat a skunk? Well, number one, skunks are real easy to see in the dark. The black part's not, but the white part is. Okay? And anything the size of a skunk is prey, which means that your cat that you let roam at night could become great horned owl prey. But owls, like most birds, do not have a sense of smell. So if a skunk sprays, they don't smell it. So evidently skunks smell bad, but they taste good if you can't smell. So hold your nose if you ever have to eat one. But in any case, I get a lot of owls in there that are injured for some reason, and they almost always smell of skunk. That's one of their favorite prey items. But anything that size they can feed on, but they'll feed on smaller items as well, but they have a tendency to eat the bigger items, which brings to mind something that all owls do when they eat something. Of course, when you digest something, you've got to use the bathroom, right? Okay. But with owls, they do something very interesting. They actually cough up the indigestible portions of their food in what's known as an owl pellet. And an owl pellet looks like this. Now, if you saw a pile of these on the ground, it might be dog poop. But if you find one or two, and it's dry and it doesn't smell bad, it's probably an owl pellet, particularly you see little bone bits sticking out of it. But a pellet doesn't come out of this end. A pellet comes out of this end. So all the indigestible portions, fur, feathers, bone, whatever, comes out in a little compact pellet, and is coughed up once or twice a day by an owl, okay? And we'll find these where owls roost, and they're often collected and sterilized and sold to science supply houses where they're sold to science classes. Some of you might have dissected an owl, or some of these folks might be going to school at some point in time here might be dissecting an owl pellet. And if you haven't dissected an owl pellet, isn't an adult, you should dissect an owl pellet. Because scientists do it to find out about all the small prey items that live in an area they sometimes couldn't find otherwise, and we know what owls eat because of that. But an owl like this that eats large prey items is not going to eat the bones very often. They're going to eat the meat. So they won't cough up as much pellets depending on what they're feeding on. They're feeding on small mice and rodents, and they're eating the whole animal. You get into the bones and fur, yeah, you'll find pellets. But an animal like this that might eat a skunk is going to rip the meat off of it and eat the meat, and there'll be very little bony material there. Maybe get a little fur in there, so you might not see as many pellets like from a great horned owl as some other species, but you might depending on what they're feeding on. I think it's very interesting about owls. And I do have some owl pellets of different species you can look at here at the end of the program before I leave if you'd like to.
So what time of day do they primarily hunt their prey?
These are pretty much nighttime hunters. You know, usually about dusk they get active, but you might find any owl active at any time of day if they're not finding enough food to feed on, but very seldom do they hunt during the daytime. Yeah. Yes?
So if I was to find an owl in distress,
You notify somebody like me, but also somebody like me is sometimes hard to find unless you have my specific phone number or something like that. But if you're ever out and you find an injured bird of prey and you think it needs help, call somewhere like a nature center, call a zoo, call even a veterinarian. A lot of times you can call the local sheriff's department or somebody like that, and they will know who to call. But usually a nature center, zoo, veterinarian will have a list of wildlife rehabilitators that are in a given area. And also, if you can't do that, you can also always go to the website of the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, which is ncwildlife.org, and you can find a wildlife rehabilitator on the website county by county. But just be aware that not all of them work with birds of prey. A lot of them work with other animals, and you have to have certain permits for certain ones. So there are some counties that don't have any licensed wildlife rehabilitators in them. So sometimes you have to get help from several counties away. But a lot of times if you can get a bird in a box or something safely by putting a blanket around it or something, and then you can transport it to somebody. Sometimes a wildlife officer in your area would transport something like that to a wildlife rehabilitator nearby. So you just think of all the animal-related things in your mind and then call one of those places. They should be able to eventually lead you to a wildlife rehabilitator. So the Western North Carolina Nature Center is a great resource. If you just call them, they'll be able to set you up with somebody. Then there's always a Carolina Raptor Center in Charlotte, which specializes in bird of prey rescue as well. Yes?
I have a leghorn owl in my backyard, and I was able to photograph them in the wild.
Oh, wow, look at that.
Very, very proud of
Okay, make sure everybody takes a look at that for you. Yeah, very good. Okay, well, we're going to leave our great horned owl out there as a little ornament while we talk about a couple other owls in our area. So those are the two live owls that we're going to visit with, but we want to talk about a couple of owls as well that I don't have live in person to show you here. And because you're in the area you're at here, this is kind of a unique area. Around here you have a lot of pastures, you have a lot of open areas, barns, that sort of stuff. You know, some of you may have horses, that sort of thing. But this area in particular and other areas that are this kind of open country with some mixed woodlots, you would have this other species of owl called a barn owl. And I said barred owl before with a B-A-R-R-E-D. This is the one that a lot of people mistake it for, the barn owl, B-A-R-N, like the barn where you put your supplies in, you know, horses, cows, hay bales, that kind of stuff. So there actually is a barn owl. But notice it's a very different looking owl. White face, white underparts. The top of the owl is pretty much cinnamon brown, salt and pepper speckled color. When this bird flies overhead, it looks like an all white owl. But it's not. It's only half white, and that's the underneath that you're seeing. But barn owls, like their name implies, they actually do roost in old barns. And for many, many centuries, they've been associated living close to people. Particular agricultural areas will have old buildings like barns or any other old building will do, as long as it's not used very much, has an out-of-the-way place, a loft or something, where they can go and hide during the daytime, raise their young in there, have a sheltering roost during the daytime, and then fly out in the evening. They like to hunt grasslands, pasturelands for rodents that are called voles, which is a certain kind of a mouse that lives in our area that has furry ears, a short tail, and they live out in fields and pastures, and that's their primary food. But barn owls will eat shrews, they'll eat moles, they occasionally come to the surface, small birds they might catch, anything they can catch. But they're one of the owls that has small eyes and hunt primarily by sound. And they will actually fly low over the field and hover, listening with their face, drop down in tall grass and come up with a vole or some other small animal. So they're a very, very efficient hunter. But barn owls are pretty interesting. Also, barn owls, when you see pellets like I just showed you, those are barn owl pellets usually, because they're found routinely where they roost. And if you find a pellet out in the wild underneath the tree, you're lucky because they disintegrate so quickly in the weather out there. But inside of a building where the barn owls will roost, they cough up their pellets there day after day after day. They're inside of a building, they dry out, and they're preserved, and you can go and collect sometimes dozens of them at a time, fill up a bucket full of them if you have a barn owl population. So that's where most supply houses get their pellets, are mostly from barn owls. Now I'm going to play a few barn owl calls because if you ever go to an old building where barn owls roost, you may back away, you might be frightened because you might think you found a haunted house. Because barn owls are noted for some odd sounds they make. Whereas the barred owl hoots, and this guy makes some hooting sounds, and the screech owl makes those other sounds we heard. The barn owl makes very different sounds. None of them are hoots, but they're very, very odd. Screams, screeches, wails, and hisses. That's a barn owl. Imagine walking into a dark barn and hearing that coming from the dark. You're seeing an owl that looks all white come flying out across the darkness because it's a ghost, you know. The babies are especially known for hissing. If you approach their nest, these little white downy babies will rise up out of the dark and they'll undulate like serpents. And they hiss with an incredibly loud hissing sound. You would swear it's a nest of snakes, you know. People are very frightened when they hear barn owl sounds in these old buildings, barns. And that gives rise to the fact that a lot of people think that those areas are haunted. So a haunted house might be inhabited, not by ghosts, but by barn owls. And I used to have some barn owls. They passed away of old age now, but I love to have them on program because they're such a beautiful bird, and maybe I'll have one again in the future. But they're not as common as far as rehab birds. All the ones I've gotten in the last few years have unfortunately not made it. They've been too late to save and all. But I used to have a pair, and I can only imagine somebody walking by my place, the sounds they heard. Because I would hear these odd sounds coming from the back of my house when the enclosure was. These screech, things sound like cars screeching their brakes to a stop, and screams and wails. You know, just very odd. So barn owls are pretty cool. But there is another little owl here that we want to mention that you won't find down here around Polk County. You're going to have to go up in the mountains a little bit higher. And if you go to the very highest mountain elevations here, you might see this next owl, which is an owl a lot of people have no idea lives here. It's our smallest owl. It's even smaller than a screech owl. So maybe about 2/3 of the size of a screech owl, but with a big, broad, wide head, bright yellow eyes, kind of like this, but with a totally rounded head, no horns, is our saw-whet owl. Saw-whet owl, which has an interesting name, and you might wonder, why would you call it a saw-whet owl? Well, these guys, in a moment, but these owls are high mountain elevations. They're actually more Canadian and northeastern United States, but of course, if you know anything about western North Carolina, the mountains that we have here, that's like an extension of the northeast, so you find a lot of interesting things at the highest elevations that would be at home further north in southern Canada or the northeast United States. And screech owls, saw-whet owls are somewhat migratory, so they're not there all the time, and they may migrate actually to coastal areas and other areas a little farther east and lower elevation and turn up in places in the wintertime, but they're definitely their breeding place here in North Carolina. The southernmost part of their breeding range is the high mountain elevations, usually above 4,000 to 5,000 feet, where the spruce fir forest of the high mountains meets the northern hardwood zone between about 4,000 and 5,000 feet. But they're not real common there, but they definitely are there. But they get their name saw-whet owl from the fact that long ago when early settlers came to our area, and I'm not that old, but I remember one of these things. I remember seeing it in one of my grandparents' yards. Something. It was a big old structure. It had pedals on it, and you could sit on it, and you turn a wheel that had an axle there by pedal power, and you're turning this big stone, a grinding stone that you could sharpen axes on. And that's something that the early settlers used to have all the time before we had electric power. They made this big grinding stone to sharpen their saws and axes. And when it turned on its axle, all it would make like that as it went around, a very repetitive squeaking sound. And that's what the sound of this bird sounds like. Not hoots, not screams, not screeches, kind of a tooting, whistling sound, repetitive over and over and over, much like a squeaky wheel turning. Somebody oil that axle. That didn't do any good. More grease. So that's one of those birds that has a cultural connection to its name, saw-whet, because it's sharpening the saw, the wet stone. That's what we sharpen things. It's called a wet stone, saw-whet owl. So if you're lucky when you're at a high elevation, you might run into one of those at some point in time. And to finish up here, I'm going to mention a couple of other owls. You know, most of the owls, really there's only like about 5 species of owls that routinely are found here in this area, year-round. The barn owl, great horned owl, screech owl, saw-whet owl, barred owl. You know, compared to all the other birds that are found here, it's really a small group, you know, but we're talking about predatory birds too, because there's less of them. But there are occasionally a couple of other owl species, actually 3, that might turn up here in western North Carolina or any part of North Carolina or some areas of the southeast at other times. Most of our birds are not migratory as far as the owls are. A lot of our daytime diurnal raptors are migratory, but very few of our owl species are. But there are some northern species